I have so many people reach out to me about travel insurance policies. They're led to believe through clever marketing that this is a requirement if you're about to travel outside of your country of residence. The airlines are on it too now, and will often push travelers to purchase trip protection through one of their main travel insurance providers that they want to do business with. On the flip side, one of the most common issues travelers encounter is illness, and there are differences in how each country may require payment for medical care. So this is what we're going to discuss today. Is travel insurance a huge scam, or are you living on the edge without adequate coverage? My name is Evan, and I've advised hundreds of travelers about their safety in some of the riskiest locations on the planet. If you like what you see, please like this video, subscribe, check out some of the other videos that may be of interest. It's all a really big help to me. So travel insurance can take many different forms. Each policy has different levels of coverage depending on the company, cost, and the needs of the person being insured. There are also different options beyond just traditional travel insurance companies, so we're going to talk about all of those in this video. So let's talk about traditional travel insurance just in general. So traditional travel insurance can be purchased for one single trip, or you can purchase it on a longer basis. Usually it's yearly coverage, especially if you're a frequent traveler. Coverage varies, but it may cover things like trip cancellation, trip interruption, luggage delays, lost or stolen baggage, emergency medical services, emergency dental services, emergency evacuation, repatriation, and others depending on the policy. So it really varies from policy to policy. You should know that you can purchase primary or secondary coverage for travel insurance. So what does that really mean? Secondary coverage will only cover things that your primary coverage does not, and it's oftentimes cheaper in terms of the premiums. Primary coverage will cover everything within the policy and not require an initial claim with your other provider, but the premiums are often much more expensive than secondary insurance. So I'll give you an example about that. So say you are traveling from the United States to France. You end up getting sick in France and you go to the hospital, but you have secondary travel insurance because your own policy back at home in the United States offers some level of assistance for you when you're abroad. So that primary coverage through your traditional medical insurance would kick in first, and then whatever that doesn't cover would be for the secondary coverage. And that goes for the other way around too. So if nothing's covered under your medical insurance at home and you need to potentially get medical service while you're abroad, then you would want to get some kind of primary coverage. So the most popular providers include companies like Travelex, Nationwide, Berkshire Hathaway, their travel protection division, World Trip, Allianz, and various others. So there's great resources online for you to compare and contrast each of these different policies and just see which one would work best for you. The cost of these policies will vary pretty greatly depending on where you're going, being one of the factors, if you have pre-existing conditions, and then your own demographic data among other factors as well. So that would include things like, your age. So if you're very elderly, it might be that the travel insurance policy is much higher for you. And then in terms of pre-existing conditions, you should note that it's likely that you'll have to identify that you have pre-existing conditions and let that particular travel insurance company know. So switching gears a little bit, there's also pretty good coverage through some credit cards as well. So if you're not familiar, there are premium, quote unquote, travel credit cards that may offer similar levels of insurance to some of those travel insurance plans through the traditional providers that we mentioned before. So most of these offer pretty similar levels of coverage in terms of trip cancellation and interruption, any luggage delays or lost or stolen baggage. And then a lot of them will also offer auto rental insurance, whether that be both collision and liability or one or the other. So that can be super useful because oftentimes a travel insurance policy won't, include auto insurance under its traditional policy. So you could always add that, but it might be useful, especially if you have one of these credit cards. So unfortunately, just to note, There's only a few credit cards that actually offer any sort of emergency medical services and medical evacuation coverage at the time of this video. That might change in the future. But the big one that I would mention is the Chase Sapphire Reserve. So this is one of those premium credit cards that does have a pretty high fee. So, you have to take that into account, but it does offer that additional service. So essentially you wouldn't have to purchase any additional travel insurance, for most locations that you're going to. The other major credit cards with trip protections would be the Chase Sapphire Preferred, so within that same family, but a little bit of a downgrade from the Sapphire Reserve, the Capital One Venture X, and then also the Amex Platinum cards. You should really review each card's coverage just to see what you may need, and then it should indicate, what those coverage amounts are as well. So you'll be able to understand, is that going to be adequate for my particular trip that I'm taking, and do I need additional coverage as well? One very important caveat with this is that the trip must be purchased with that credit card that you're potentially going to be using as your insurance in order for it to be fully covered. So they will not cover a trip if you have not purchased it with this particular card in question. So you have to keep that in mind. For me, I do have one of these credit cards and I do use it on most of my trips just because the protections are so good. And I want to make sure that I do have some kind of coverage, especially when it comes to rental car, auto collision, things like that. So one big question that always comes up for people is, what about my own insurance, right? Is that going to cover me while I go abroad? The answer really is dependent on your insurance, right? So it's a very complex answer depending on where you're from, what your insurance coverage looks like. But I'll give you a few examples here. So the US, right, as everybody knows, US medical insurance is extremely complex, but there are cases where your private insurance may cover some aspect of emergency medical care outside of the United States. It is important to note that both Medicaid and Medicare, which are programs, if you're not familiar, that are national government-sponsored programs in order to provide people health care, they do not cover you outside of the US, and oftentimes they won't cover you besides emergencies outside of your home state as well. So you can't use it for that, but your own personal private insurance, for example, if you're employed by an employer and they provide you insurance, it may cover something. So it's always useful to take a look. You can always call them up and ask if there's any sort of way that they cover partially for medical expenses while you're abroad. For citizens of the European Union, travel to other EU countries, you are entitled to seek treatment for any sort of unforeseen medical issues with your European health insurance card. So that's super useful, right? If you are from Germany and you decide to go to Portugal and you get sick and you have to go to the hospital, that will be covered by your insurance that you have in Germany because there are reciprocal agreements all across the European Union. UK citizens, so before when they were part of the EU, right, they would have had that same reciprocal agreement. Unfortunately now it's important to check. There are some reciprocal agreements in place between other governments and also the National Health Service, so it's just important to verify beforehand. In Canada, each province's health plan is different, right? So in some cases it's a little bit like the US, a little more of a complex environment, but I would say some of those provincial health plans may actually cover services outside of Canada, but in general, they're not going to cover a lot, or if they do, it's going to be a pretty limited amount. So these are just a few examples of different places, and you can see how complex that is, right? So it really varies from place to place, but it's very important to verify what your specific healthcare plan may or may not cover before you go to a particular location, and if you need coverage while you're there. And so just to add to that, you do want to make sure you understand that system, have ample time to get another health insurance policy for travel specifically if you need it. And then the last big question is really, can I self-insure for a trip, right? So emergencies can really occur at any time, regardless of where you are. The cost of any emergency service and medical care will vary greatly from location to location as well. So you should be aware that there could be significant costs if you are planning on self-insuring yourselves. There are some countries, specifically outside of what we consider the global West, for lack of a better term, but outside of Europe, the US, places like that, where they will not release you from the hospital until you pay whatever charges that you need to pay for the care that you've received. You should also take just a mental note to yourself and personally assess your health status and whether it's a good idea for you to self-insure, right? So if you have a pre-existing condition, if you're over a certain age, or you have major health concerns that would be an important thing to think about before you go on a trip, it would really be wise to think twice before going for the self-insurance route. Perhaps you're super rich and that doesn't really matter to you, then all power to you. But I think for most people, it's important to really think about, what is it going to be like for my own personal health? Is it likely that I am going to get sick? All those different things sort of add up and make you think about, like, what is it going to be that I need to do to make sure that I'm going to have adequate medical coverage if I need it while I'm there. A major health issue in some locations may not be able to be treated adequately too. So I would just say, there are countries where you wouldn't want to get a blood transfusion for specific reasons, right? Blood may not be properly tested. All of those locations, you want to be very, very cautious about major surgeries, things like that could come up. So in those cases, you may need some kind of medical evacuation. Medical evacuations are extremely, extremely expensive in many cases and involve, movement by some kind of air ambulance. So whether that be a helicopter or an airplane, and it just really depends on your condition, right? If it's a critical condition, then they're likely to move you by air. So in those cases, right, it can get as expensive as hundreds of thousands of dollars, right, depending on that particular provider who's moving you. And that's just for the medical care and the movement while you're getting to the location you're supposed to go. So I would say that particular part of it is something to keep in mind, especially if you're going very far afield in a location where adequate health service is not available to you. And then I would just add sort of an additional note for cruise passengers. So medical services on cruise ships can be very expensive, and the limited facilities on board mean that, if there is actually a severe medical issue that needs to be treated at a hospital, it's likely they're also going to medically evacuate you. And as a result, right, that expense falls on you. And so you're going to have to deal with, some kind of charge to potentially, take you off the ship in a helicopter, something like that. And you just need to ensure that, you do purchase some kind of insurance coverage. A lot of cruise lines will offer it, but you can also just purchase it from one of those travel insurance companies as well that I mentioned above before you go, just so you don't get stuck with some exorbitant bill if an issue comes up. And then just a little bit about additional insurance coverages. So there are some locations that are susceptible to political upheaval, instability, terrorist attacks, kidnapping, and other issues. In those areas, it may be useful to purchase some kind of additional coverage related to security evacuations or kidnapping. These plans are much less frequently purchased as fewer people tend to travel to those locations, but it's going to be important depending on where you go. So, some of those yearly plans that I talked about before, they may include some of these provisions, but you do need to identify that with your insurance provider and just understand if they're even going to cover you, right? There's some locations that, they refuse to cover you altogether. So keep that in mind. And then the last thing I would say in terms of that is you shouldn't rely solely on your respective government to provide emergency evacuations for security or political reasons. Depending on the case, it could be that they do provide some kind of emergency evacuation, or sometimes they don't, right? So that's entirely their prerogative. And if you want control over your own situation, then you need to make sure that you have some way to get out of the country, some kind of insurance to do that. So overall, right, the issue of travel insurance is a super complex one, as we just talked about. I would never recommend getting insurance offered by an airline just to cover that particular part of your trip, but it may be very useful to seek out travel insurance for yourself ahead of the trip through one of those providers I mentioned. Think about your own personal risks and the place you're visiting. Both of these metrics will be super important to make those final decisions on whether you need a travel insurance plan or not. Policies can be modified and made bespoke for your individual needs, so always make sure you discuss what you need with a potential travel insurance company. And then lastly, if you do want the credit cards for that particular coverage, then look into that a little bit, just understand what you may need from that coverage and if it's going to be adequate for you. So hopefully this gives you a helpful overview of this complex issue. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.